Beneath the porch, two tiny German shepherd pups hung helplessly, swallowed by the blizzard's icy grip, silent, frozen, and utterly abandoned. Their faint whimpers vanished into the howling wind, their young hearts slowing with every snowflake that settled around them. Far away, Navy SEAL Caleb Hawkins was driving through that merciless storm, a man fleeing memories, not missions. Suddenly, Rex Caleb's loyal K9 companion perked up ears, catching a sound beyond any human's reach. Trusting his dog's instincts, Caleb stepped into the blizzard's whiteout and found two fragile souls trembling, destined to change everything. Because sometimes saving someone else means they save us in return. But before we dive deeper, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your homeland in the comments below. Out here, winter had consumed all of Wyoming. Snow fell like shards of glass, relentless and silent, transforming the forest into a realm of ghostly white shadows. The pine trees moaned under the wind's icy breath, carrying the scent of cold isolation. Along a forgotten mountain path, a lone cabin stood half buried under mounds of snow. Its roof bowed beneath the storm's weight, its windows dim and distant, its chimney releasing thin wisps of smoke that vanished instantly into the swirling air. This was no place meant for visitors. Inside, Caleb Hawkins sat by the fire, the flickering amber glow dancing over his somber face like a fragile heartbeat. At 38, he still bore the commanding presence of a soldier, tall, broad-shouldered, with every movement purposeful and measured. Yet behind his steely gaze lay a heavy burden that no training could ever erase. His dark blonde hair brushed his collar, streaked with premature silver, while a trimmed beard framed his strong jawline. Those steel-blue eyes, once sharp and commanding, now held the quiet resignation of a man who had given up expecting to be needed. He lived here alone with Rex, his 6-year-old German shepherd, whose black and tan coat shimmered in the firelight, a jagged scar crossing his right side like a pale river etched in darkness. Rex had been a Navy working dog, fearless, loyal, trained to sniff out explosives alongside Caleb through endless desert nights. Now they fought a different kind of battle, silent survival. Outside, the storm howled like a wild beast, thrashing against the cabin windows. Caleb leaned back in his time-worn wooden chair, his rough hand brushing through his beard. He had learned to exist without voices, without laughter, without purpose. Solitude was his penance since that mission gone wrong. The one where 3 of his brothers never returned. Their last radio call still echoed in his mind whenever the wind screamed long and loud. Rex's ears twitched, lifting his head as his muscles tensed. A low growl rumbled deep within him. Caleb looked up, furrowing his brow. "What is it, buddy?" The dog remained, frozen eyes locked on the door. Caleb strained to listen. At first, all he heard was snow beating against the wood. Then, faint beneath the wind's roar, a thin, desperate cry emerged. Heart racing, he rose. "Stay," he whispered. But Rex was already on his feet, tail low, body rigid. Caleb pulled his coat tight around his shoulders and flung open the door. The storm crashed in like an unforgiving wall. Snow swirled wildly inside, stinging his skin and blinding his sight. He stepped into the drift's boots, sinking deep into the frozen white. The faintest cry broke through the night once more, almost as if it was a figment of his imagination. He swept the flashlight over the porch, then down toward the steps. Something stirred beneath the porch beam. 2 tiny shapes dangling from a frayed rope, barely visible beneath a crust of snow. For a moment he feared they were lifeless until one of them shivered. His breath caught tight. They were puppies. Small German shepherds no older than 6 weeks hanging there together, limp their fur, frozen stiff. "Jesus," Caleb whispered through the storm, dropping to his knees, fumbling at the rope with fingers numb and clumsy. The knots were iced shut. "Hold on," he gritted through clenched teeth. "Hold on." He ripped the line free and gathered them into his chest. Feather-light and fragile, their paws curled in tight from the cold. He tucked them inside his coat and turned back to the door, the wind biting fiercely at his face. Inside, he slammed the door shut and staggered toward the fire. His breath came in ragged gasps as he unzipped his coat and laid the two tiny bodies on a woolen blanket. They lay still, their fur black and tan like Rex's, but caked with snow and ice. He rubbed them fast and firm, with his palms whispering low, come on, stay with me." Rex whined softly and circled close. The big dog lowered his head, sniffing the small, frozen forms. One puppy twitched, then the other. A faint, hopeful whimper pierced the stillness. Caleb felt his chest unclench. He reached for a towel, drying their little paws, their ears, their bellies. They trembled again. Good, that meant life was returning. He reached for a pot of warming water on the stove, dipping a finger in, and tracing it gently along their mouths. One licked weakly, then the other followed. Caleb exhaled shakily, laughing and crying all at once without realizing it. "You're fighters, huh?" The fire snapped behind him. He felt the heat rise along his back as the room filled with steam from his soaked coat. Sitting cross-legged, he wrapped the puppies snugly in an old flannel shirt. Rex settled beside them, his large body radiating warmth. One pup sighed softly and burrowed against Rex's chest. Caleb watched, and for the first time in years, the cabin felt less empty. He glanced at Rex, who kept his eyes locked on the fire, steady and protective. "Looks like we've got some company, partner." Rex's tail thumped once a quiet sign of approval against the floorboards. Caleb gazed at the puppies, tiny enough to fit in his hands. Whoever had left them out here never meant for them to be found. The thought twisted something raw inside him, stirring a familiar ache. People cast away what they couldn't handle, mission soldiers, even lives. He had walked both paths, rescuer and the discarded. Maybe that's why seeing these little souls struck him so deep. He found his voice a whisper. "You made it home." The word startled him home. He hadn't said it in years. Reaching out, he gently stroked one puppy's ears. "Scout," he named softly, then turning to the other who nuzzled Rex's paw tenderly. "And you'll be Daisy." The name slipped out natural, almost destined. Outside, the wind began to soften, its fury spent. Snow still drifted down slower now, like feathers falling gently against the window pane. Caleb reclined, his muscles trembling from the biting cold scanning the quiet cabin around him. His once silent sanctuary now alive with gentle movement and soft breathing. The firelight flickered boldly across the floorboards, dancing against the rifles mounted on the walls, and casting shadows over a faded photo of a Navy squad under the desert sun. Their faces lingered in his mind, men who had entrusted him, men who never made it home. For years that grief had iced over his heart, leaving him frozen inside. But now, amidst the crackling logs' whisper, he heard something new. Not ghosts, not sorrow, but the steady pulse of little hearts learning to beat again. He added another log to the fire, then knelt beside the puppies. "You're safe now?" He whispered, his voice raw, half prayer, half vow. Rex yawned, resting his muzzle softly on his paws, eyes closing in peaceful sleep. The puppies stirred and nestled closer, and Caleb watched quietly, his own breath slowing, blending with theirs. The fire's glow grew deeper, wrapping the cabin in a warm, golden embrace. Outside, snowflakes twirled through the night air, catching the faint light spilling from the window. The forest lay silent once more, the kind of silence that feels sacred. Caleb held his hands near the flames, feeling the sting of cold fade from his fingers. He glanced again at the two fragile lives born from the storm, as if angels themselves had whispered their names into the wind. Slowly he settled back, his body trembling not from fear, but from something harder to name. A fragile warmth, budding where the cold had ruled too long, the kind of warmth that given time could grow into hope. Caleb positioned the puppies a little closer to the fire, his hands quaking with fatigue. Outside, the snow fell endlessly soft and relentless. Inside, the tiny flames flickered higher, casting their light over the man, the dog, and the two newborn souls they had rescued. And as he whispered goodnight, his breath mingling with the fire's crackle, Caleb didn't realize that the loneliness inside him was already beginning to melt away. He placed the puppies before the warm fire, his hands still trembling from the cold. Outside snow continued its silent descent, but inside the cabin the small flame flickered gently, signaling the first spark of something miraculous. The storm had cleared, but the mountains still exhaled cold breaths. Morning light crept like pale smoke across the snow, touching frozen pines and the rooftop of Caleb's cabin. Inside, the fire had dwindled through the night, leaving only glowing embers beneath a blanket of gray ash. Caleb stirred awake in his chair, a blanket half slipping off his shoulders. The scent of smoke and damp fur hung in the still air. Rex was the first to stretch beside the hearth, a low groan escaping him, tail sweeping the floor with slow, lazy strokes. Nearby, the two puppies, Scout and Daisy, cuddled tightly in the flannel shirt Caleb had wrapped around them. Their breaths were soft, shallow, but steady. Daisy, the smaller one, bore a white patch on her chest, like a crooked star, while Scout's ears stood tall, as if already attuned to the world with soldier-like vigilance. Caleb leaned forward, rubbing the weariness from his face. A proper night's sleep had eluded him. He dared not turn away, terrified the puppy's fragile heartbeats might cease if he looked elsewhere even for a moment. Yet somehow they had made it through. "You're stronger than you seem," he murmured, his voice rough and worn from exhaustion. Rex shifted his gaze as if in agreement, tending the fire, setting a pot of water to warm, then crouching once more near the sleeping puppies. When his hand gently brushed Scout's paw, the tiny creature stirred, releasing a faint squeak that brought a soft chuckle from Caleb. It was a sound unfamiliar even to his own ears. All right, he whispered softly. "You're home now." The word home trembled on his lips, delicate and fragile, like something that might shatter if spoken too loudly. Outside, dawn unfolded across the valley, sunlight catching the icy shimmer on each branch. The wind had died down, carrying only the gentle breath of the forest. For the first time in months, the world around him no longer felt like an enemy. Still, the sight of the puppies stirred haunting memories he couldn't bury. A mission in the Hindu Kush, the snow no different than this. His team's voices crackling over the radio, then silence. The blast, the ringing in his ears, snow stained red against the unyielding white. Caleb shook his head fiercely, trying to banish the ghosts. He poured warm milk into a small cup, dipping his finger inside, letting Daisy weakly lap it off his skin, then Scout. They sipped slowly, fighting off sleep with every precious drop. Nearby, Rex lay watch, serene and patient, his scar catching the flicker of firelight. A sudden knock shattered the quiet, jolting Caleb. Not the storm this time, an actual knock at the door. He froze, tension tightening around him like a noose. No one ever came up here. Visitors were unheard of. Rex rose, ears pricked, forward tail lowered, alert and watchful. The second knock was softer, hesitant. Caleb pulled on his coat and moved to the door, hand resting cautiously on the handle. When he opened it, the cold air rushed inside, along with the faint scent of cinnamon and pine. Standing there was an older woman wrapped in a thick brown coat, her gray hair loosely pinned beneath a knitted hat dusted with snow. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and her breath came out in short, visible bursts. "Good morning, Mr. Hawkins," she said warmly, despite the chill. "I hope I'm not intruding." He blinked in surprise. Mrs. Bennett, Mary Bennett, had been one of the few people who stayed year-round in Silver Hollow, running the old bakery down in town famous for its apple bread. She was in her late 60s, small but steady, with soft wrinkles deepening when she smiled, and eyes the faded blue of worn denim, kind, yet sharp enough to see right through a man. Her husband, a fire captain, had died years ago, saving a trapped child and a dog from a burning home. Since then, Mary had devoted her life to quiet acts of kindness, baking for strangers, visiting the ill, and driving her old truck through unforgiving storms to check on anyone too stubborn to ask for help. "I brought some food," she said, lifting a wicker basket covered with a cloth. "I heard the power lines went down again up here. Figured you'd be needing something better than canned beans." Caleb stepped aside awkwardly. "You shouldn't be out on these roads," she said with a faint smile. "I've been driving these mountain roads since you wore your uniform. Son, no amount of snow's gonna chase me away. She stepped inside, stomping her boots, scanning the cabin. Still as silent as a chapel in here. You always keep it this spotless old habit, he answered. Her eyes drifted to the hearth, softening with a quiet warmth. Oh my, look at this. She bent down slowly, setting the basket down gently. Puppies. They were out in that storm, Caleb said, kneeling beside her. Under the porch beam, tied up by someone who just left them there. Her brow creased with worry. Tied up Lord above. She reached out a weathered hand, gently stroking Daisy's tiny head. The pup blinked sleepily, stretching weakly. Well, aren't you two little miracles? Caleb stayed quiet. Mary glanced at him, catching something deep in his eyes, a haunted flicker of life. You saved them, she whispered. He shrugged. Just found them, he said. But finding isn't the same as saving, she murmured, standing with a soft grunt. Maybe you didn't just stumble on them by chance. Sometimes God doesn't blow trumpets or flash lightning. Mr. Hawkins. Sometimes he just uses the nearest fool who's brave enough to open a door. He almost smiled. You think God sent me 2 half-frozen dogs? Mary locked eyes with him. I think he sent you a reason to care once more. Those words hit heavier than she meant. Caleb looked away, focusing on the fire, like it could shield him. She didn't push any further, unpacking the basket instead. Warm bread jars of soup, a small tin of honey, the smell of apples mixed with the wood smoke filling the cabin. You didn't have to do this, he said softly. Sure I did, she said, brushing off her gloves. I had a husband once who never could walk away from someone in need. He was a fireman who'd rush into a burning house just to save a dog. They made it out alive that time, but the next fire was his last. I like to believe he's still running toward something good. Her eyes shimmered, but her voice stayed steady. Sometimes the Lord sends us back just to love one more soul. Caleb swallowed hard, unsure what to say. He hadn't shared this much with anyone in months, maybe years. There was something in Mary's calm that unsettled him, the way she spoke like grace was still within reach. Thank you, he finally said, quiet but genuine. She nodded, glancing once more at the puppies, now asleep against Rex's broad chest. Take care of them. They're counting on you now. I will, he promised. She buttoned her coat, pulling her scarf tight. Another storm's blowing in tonight. If you need anything, the church's radio is still up. I'll check in by noon. He escorted her to the door as the wind whispered softly outside. She turned back once more before stepping out, her eyes warm but wise. You're not as alone as you think, Mr. Hawkins. Not anymore. When she walked down the snowy path, Caleb lingered in the doorway, watching the slippers' prints fade off into the trees. The wind had gone silent now, but somehow it felt less empty. He closed the door and faced the hearth once more. Rex had already curled tightly again, his massive frame, a living fortress of warmth around the sleeping pups. Scout stirred in his sleep, letting out a tiny bark that made Caleb chuckle quietly to himself. He poured himself a steaming cup of coffee, settled into his chair, and gazed deeply into the flickering flames. For the first time in what felt like years, the cabin was alive with gentle sounds, the soft breathing of the dogs, the quiet snap of burning logs, and the lingering echo of Mary's heartfelt words. Outside, the snow began to fall once more, soft and unhurried, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside, the cabin seemed to exhale, alive with warmth. Caleb leaned back, his eyelids heavy, but his spirit calm. Through the frosted window, he caught sight of Mary's truck headlights winding down the mountain's winding road, twin beams of light melting into the endless blanket of white. He glanced again at his sleeping companions and whispered softly, "You're safe now." And for the very first time since arriving in these mountains, that humble cabin didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a new beginning. The storm had finally broken 2 days earlier, yet winter still held the mountains in its icy grip. The air bit sharp enough to sting the skin, and the trees glittered beneath the pale morning sun like countless frozen spears piercing the sky. Caleb Hawkins stepped out of the cabin, his boots crunching steadily on the crisp new snow. He tightened his coat around his shoulders, his breath clouding visibly in the cold air. Behind him, Rex followed silently, the large German shepherd's paws marking neat impressions beside his own. Inside Scout and Daisy, the two puppies whimpered softly, their voices muffled by the sturdy wooden walls. Caleb stopped and listened intently. The forest had fallen into a profound silence once again, a silence so complete that every tiny noise, a snapping twig, the rustle of wind through pine needles weighed heavy with meaning. Something deep in his gut told him their story was far from over. No one just abandoned two purebred German shepherd puppies to freeze out here. Not this remote, not tied up and left for dead like that. He adjusted the strap of his pack, the one still bearing faint army insignia, and began making his way down the trail toward the old bridge. The very same bridge where he had found those helpless pups hanging beneath the beam like forgotten scraps of cloth. Each step sank deep into the snow, the air around him whispering with the soft hiss of frost. Rex moved ahead, ears alert, his breath puffing out in quick white bursts. The world seemed frozen in time until Caleb reached the riverbend clearing. There stood the bridge, silence itself embodied. A worn skeletal frame of wood, its railings half buried beneath thick ice. Below, snow had piled uneven and heavy, hiding the earth beneath its cold cover. Caleb knelt beside the beam, where the rope had once been tied, brushing aside the fresh snow. The rope was gone, but faint marks remained, two deep grooves where something heavy had rubbed persistently against the wood. Then his eyes caught something else. Boots. Large boots, not his own. The tread was military, deep wide, impressive, belonging to someone tall and solid. At least two sets marched from the bridge toward the tree line. He trailed their path for several yards before halting, noticing another clue, a fragment of torn rope, thick and synthetic, the kind used for securing heavy loads, industrial rope, nothing a hunter would carry in these parts. Caleb turned the piece between his fingers, his voice a low murmur. This isn't a random act. Rex let out a short, hard bark. Caleb's gaze swept the horizon, no sign of movement, nothing fresh stirring the stillness. No smoke, only endless expanse of white. Yet his instincts, the very ones that had shielded him through war, tightened like steel wire. He slipped the rope into his pocket, scanned the silent landscape once more, then turned his steps toward home. He needed clarity. He needed to speak with Mary. By afternoon, the wind stirred again. Snowflakes twirled like dancers among the pines as he ascended the ridge. The cabin emerged ahead, half-veiled in frost's embrace. Mary Bennett's rusty old truck was parked out front, its red paint faded and dusted in white. She stood near the porch, stamping her feet to stay warm. A thick knitted scarf wound tightly around her chin. When she saw him, relief flooded her face. "You were gone all morning. I was about to send out a search party." Caleb gave a faint, tired smile. "Just took a walk," he said. Mary tilted her head. "That kind of walk doesn't call for a knife and a pack, Mr. Hawkins." He set his bag down, leaning heavily against the porch railing. I went back to the bridge. Her eyes sharpened. "Did you find anything?" He nodded slowly. Footprints, 2 sets, heavy boots, and a rope industrial grade, not farm. Whoever left those pups behind didn't just abandon them. They meant to end them. Mary pressed her lips tight, silence stretching long. Then she opened the wicker basket. She'd brought bread, soup, and something else. This time, a folded sheet of paper. "I was hoping you'd be here," she said, handing it over. "You need to see this." He unfolded it carefully. A rough sketch in pencil showed 2 men carrying something bulky over their shoulders, maybe sacks or bags. The note below read, "They took the crying bags into the woods." Caleb frowned. "Who drew this? Jacob Miller?" She replied softly. "He's only 10, comes to Sunday school every week. His mama thought he was making things up, but I know that boy straight. He doesn't lie. He said he saw 2 men near the old freight road 3 nights before the storm hit." Caleb looked at her with intensity. "Did he see their faces?" Mary shook her head. "Just dark coats in the white truck. One man laughed and said, 'Nobody's going to find them now.'" He didn't understand the meaning, but I do. Her voice lowered. "Those weren't men from around here." Caleb folded the paper with care, feeling his heartbeat quicken not with fear, but something sharper. Purpose. You think they're still out there? People who do things like that don't just vanish, she said, tightening her scarf against the chill. And I don't believe those pups ended up under your porch by accident. Maybe God meant for them to find you first. He almost chuckled, but her grave tone silenced all doubt. The wind whipped through the pines, carrying a sound that made them both turn toward the tree line. Was it only branches shifting or something more sinister? Mary sighed deeply. You be careful, Caleb. The world out here isn't as quiet as it seems. He nodded quietly. I will. And thank you for believing that, boy. She smiled with a soft, worn kindness, the kind born from surviving countless harsh winters. Faith's all we have left to trust. She climbed into her truck, the engine coughing before it roared to life, and began winding down the mountain trail. Caleb watched until her taillights vanished into the endless white. Rex nudged close his tail, brushing gently against Caleb's leg as the sky turned a gentle shade of violet dusk, settling softly over the distant mountains. Caleb clenched his gloves tighter and focused on the trail leading back to the bridge, the very path those footprints had traced. A deep stirring welled up inside him, that familiar surge from years ago, the sharp clarity at the start of a mission. The calm before the storm. The inhale before the danger strikes. He was no longer a soldier, but that didn't matter. Some instincts never fade away. They lie dormant, waiting. He crouched, brushing his gloved hand over the snow, discovering the faint outline of the trail once more, half hidden beneath the drifting wind. The tracks led further into the forest, drawing toward the foothills, where the trees thickened and the weight of the air grew heavy. He rose slowly, twilight, painting his face in soft hues. Rex, he murmured. The dog perked his ears. Looks like it's time to get to work once again. Rex gave a low bark, and side by side they pressed forward. The wind sifted softly through the pines, carrying the distant sound of snow shifting under footsteps unseen. As the fading light slipped behind the ridge, Caleb felt something he hadn't in years, a purpose worth embracing. Not for nation nor orders, but for the quiet, voiceless lives someone had desperately tried to erase. Snow crunched beneath his boots, each step shedding the man he was and forging the man he was becoming. Ahead, the forest waited silent, bitterly cold, and brimming with untold secrets. The trail stretched out before him, swallowed gradually by the dark. He glanced at Rex, his oldest companion, and whispered with steady resolve, "We've got another mission, old friend." The forest darkened further as Caleb and Rex followed the last trail of footprints. The sun was already dipping below the ridge, casting bleeding orange rays through the trees before fading into a cold gray dusk. The temperature plummeted sharply, and every exhale turned to mist in the frigid air. Caleb moved cautiously through the pine forest boots, sinking softly into the deep snow. Rex padding just ahead, nose low, muscles taut with focus. The air carried a strange mixture oil metal, and something sharp and sour foreign to this wild place. They arrived at a small valley nestled between two slopes, where trees twisted thick and gnarled. In the clearing stood a cluster of wooden sheds, old hunting cabins, but far too many to be just that. Too orderly, too deliberate. Fresh tire tracks scarred the snow, and outside the nearest shack, a generator hummed quietly beneath a tarp. Caleb ducked behind a fallen log, eyes narrowing. "Someone's living out here," he whispered. Rex's ears twitched, his body tensing forward. They waited in silence. Minutes stretched. Then sounds broke the stillness, a low bark, followed by a rough man's shout. "Keep it down!" Another bark answered back, weaker, almost a whimper. Caleb's jaw clenched tight. Dogs were trapped inside, many of them. He pulled out his phone, switched it to silent, and began recording quietly. Moving closer, the snow crunched softly beneath his boots, every step measured and careful. Through a crack in the wall, he spotted shadows shifting inside. Two men wore heavy jackets, one tall and broad with a shaved head, the other shorter and stocky, his beard tangled and flecked with gray. Mud caked their gloves and boots. "One of them kicked a cage," the tall man muttered. "These dogs ain't pure enough," he said. The other just shrugged. "Doesn't matter as long as the buyers pay," Caleb thought, stomach churning. There were at least half a dozen cages, each holding dogs of all sizes, some German shepherds, others Belgian Malinois. Their coats were tangled, eyes dimmed by fear. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a cold, calculated trade, a shadowy market trafficking stolen, abused working dogs. He zoomed his camera in, capturing faces, movements, the rough pens. He could hear the generator's low drone and dogs' silent whimpers beneath the men's harsh laughter. Whispering to Rex, "Stay," but his dog's tail was rigid, eyes blazing with a quiet fury. Then behind him, a twig snapped. Caleb froze. A voice barked out, "Hey, who's out there?" He dropped low, heart pounding, sliding behind the closest tree. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over the snowy ground. "Probably just a coyote," one man muttered. "Check it anyway," the other said. Caleb crawled backward, careful not to leave deep tracks, but the beam caught his boot prints. "Someone's been here." The voice hardened. "Grab the gun." Rush of adrenaline surged, old training snapping into focus. "Rex, move," Caleb hissed. The German shepherd darted into the shadows, leading him as he ran downhill. A gunshot shattered the silence, splintering a tree just inches from his head. Another followed, ringing out across the ridge. Snow burst at his side as he bolted. He crouched behind a boulder, gasping, clutching his phone tightly. The camera was still rolling. He powered off the screen and tucked it away, crawling along the rock face until the gunfire died down. Men yelled above their voices, angry but uncertain, echoing through the pines. Night was closing in fast now, swallowing the world in deep blue-gray shadows. Caleb gave a soft whistle. Rex emerged silently from behind a thicket of evergreens, his fur dusted with fresh snow, eyes sharp and glowing amber. "Good boy," Caleb breathed. "Tonight we're not going down." They slipped into the darkness, tracing the river's icy edge. By the time the cabin loomed ahead, the sky had turned black, snow swirling all around. Time had slipped by, unnoticed hours maybe. The cold pierced through his gloves. His lungs burned from the run. Yet another sound caught his ear, a faint, distant noise on the wind. A motor different from the generator's hum. Tires struggling, spinning. Then a muffled crash. Caleb halted, listening hard. The noise came from the main road where the cliffs bent sharply close to the forest. He took off, Rex running alongside. Rounding the curve, weak headlights flickered below. Mary Bennett's old pickup was wedged sideways on the icy road, back tires dangling over a ditch. One headlight blinked erratically, while steam hissed from under the hood. Caleb's gut twisted. "Mary!" he shouted. Through the frosted windshield, he saw her fighting to open the door. Her face was ghostly pale in the dim light, eyes wide with fear. He sprinted, boots skidding on ice. "Don't move," he called out. "I've got you." The truck creaked ominously as he reached it, metal groaning beneath its own weight. Mud and snow churned underfoot. He grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, and unbuckled her seatbelt. "Come on," he urged, voice steady but urgent. "Take my arm." Mary's gloved hands shook as she reached out for him. Her face, typically composed and strong, appeared delicate beneath the headlight's soft glow. Her gray hair escaping from its pins, rosy cheeks flushed by the biting cold. I lost control," she stammered. "The road?" she whispered. "I understand," he replied. "We'll talk about it later." He wrenched her out just as the truck shuddered violently and began to skid. With one last surge, he pulled her back onto the snow-covered ground, both collapsing as the vehicle tilted forward, scraping harshly against the embankment before settling nose first into the ditch. For a brief moment, silence reigned. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the truck's cooling engine. Then Mary let out a soft, breathless laugh. "Looks like the Lord still needs you to rescue stubborn women from ditches," she said with a tired smile. Caleb returned her smile, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "Guess that's true." He helped her to her feet, brushing snow off her coat gently. "You shouldn't have been driving up here," he said carefully. "I had to," she replied, her voice steadier now. Something felt off. "I came to check on you." Her eyes searched his face, filling with resolve. "Judging by your look, I was right," she said. Hesitating, he recounted everything: the sheds, the cages, the men, the gunfire. Her face darkened, the warmth draining away. "People who hurt animals like that?" she murmured, shaking her head in sorrow. "They deserve a special place in hell." He nodded solemnly. "I've got enough footage to take to the sheriff, but I need to stay low tonight." "You will," she said, her voice firm. "And you'll do it somewhere warm." By the time they returned to the cabin, both were frostbitten and weary. The fire still whispered softly, like an old friend waiting patiently. Mary sank down slowly, rubbing her arms, as Caleb added fresh logs to the blaze. The warmth spread swiftly, casting the room in golden light. Rex lay close by the hearth, his head resting protectively beside the puppies. Scout stirred, releasing a sleepy whimper. Mary offered a faint, tender smile. "They're growing," she whispered. Caleb gave a quiet nod. "They're fighters." She met his gaze, her eyes soft, but filled with quiet strength. "You know," she said gently, "my husband used to say when you save one life, it's never just one. It changes everything around it." He looked unsure, watching her. She reached out, laying her hand lightly over his. "Caleb," her voice was steady, full of quiet certainty. "You were meant to open that door." For the first time, he didn't argue. He merely met her gaze, the firelight flickering in his eyes. The darkness that had lingered so long began to soften. Outside, the wind had calmed, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the fire burned bright and steady, and for the first time, Caleb's face no longer looked haunted. It looked truly alive. Morning arrived in silence, as if the mountain itself had chosen to rest. Overnight, the snow had ceased, leaving a world draped in shimmering silver. Within the cabin, the fire still whispered gently, its light flowing like warm water over the wooden walls. Caleb awoke first, his back stiff from a night spent in the chair by the hearth. The faint scents of burnt wood and fresh coffee lingered in the air. He blinked away his exhaustion and cast a glance toward the cot. Mary Bennett lay beneath a wool blanket, her face serene but pale. She had twisted her ankle during the crash. Though the bruise had deepened overnight, her spirit remained unbroken. Her silver hair spilled from beneath a knitted hat, the strands shimmering like frost kissed by morning light. When she opened her eyes, a faint smile graced her lips. "Looks like you didn't catch a single wink," she said, her voice still rough with weariness. Caleb poured her a cup of warm water and gently handed it to her. "I've survived worse nights," he answered quietly. She accepted the cup, her hands trembling just a bit. "I believe that," she said, her gaze steady on him. "You've been through more than most in one lifetime, haven't you?" He didn't reply, only added another log to the fire. The flames leapt upward, casting golden light across the wooden floor. Rex stretched close to the hearth, yawning wide, while Scout and Daisy scurried around his paws, their small claws tapping against the floor as they chased each other awkwardly in circles, tails wagging, wildly bumping into Mary's boots and drawing laughter from her lips. It was the first genuine sound of joy to fill the cabin in years. Caleb glanced over, surprised by how effortless it felt. "They're trouble already," he muttered, though a gentle warmth softened his voice for the first time. Mary watched as he knelt to repair the window by the stove. One wooden pane had cracked during the storm, letting cold wind whistle through. Caleb roughly measured a plank, slicing it with careful steadiness, his scarred hands sure despite the years that marked them. Veins on his forearm traced like ancient rivers, proof of years hauling loads heavier than his regrets. He hammered the board into place, the steady rhythm of pounding echoing softly. When finished, sunlight streamed through a narrow break between the slats. A bright beam crossed the room, landing gently on Mary's face. She closed her eyes and murmured a prayer. Caleb paused, watching her lips. "Who's in your prayers?" he asked quietly. Opening her eyes, sunlight glistened within them. "For you," she said simply. "For those who forget they still matter." Caleb looked away, uneasy with her kindness. "You don't have to do that." "Oh, but I do," she replied. "Every night I pray for the lost, the ones who stop believing they can come home. Some find their way back. Some never do. I'd like to believe you're one of my answered prayers." He shook his head, half smiling. "I'm not so sure. God's been quiet when listening to me for a long time." Mary leaned back against her pillow. "He listens," she said with quiet conviction. "But he doesn't shout back. He waits. Sometimes he sends reminders, not miracles." Her gaze drifted to the puppies now huddled in a soft pile by Rex. Sometimes those reminders come on 4 paws and soft fur. Caleb chuckled softly. It felt strange, like hearing a voice that belonged to someone else. "You sound just like my mother used to," he said. "She must have been a wise woman," Mary replied. He had no answer. His mother's voice had long since faded from memory, buried beneath years of silence and snow. Yet as the sunlight brushed his face, he almost remembered the gentle tone in her words, the same warm cadence Mary used when speaking of faith. The day unfolded slowly. Caleb tidied the stove, sealed another leak in the roof, and stirred a humble stew from the provisions Mary had brought from her pantry. She insisted on pitching in, but he firmly refused. "You get some rest," he told her. "I've got this covered." "You sound just like my son," she chuckled softly. "Bossy, but with a heart." "You have a son?" Caleb asked, his curiosity piqued. Her smile dimmed ever so slightly. "Had," she corrected gently. "Elliot was a paramedic. He died in a flood while trying to rescue a family trapped in their car. He always said it wasn't bravery driving him. It was the thought of what it would be like not to act." Caleb found himself at a loss for words. He stirred the stew in quiet reflection, the fire crackling warmly beneath the pot. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Mary reached out her hand, resting softly over his wrist. Her touch was warm despite the chill in the air. "Don't be. He lived true to how God made him. Maybe you're built the same way. You just lost sight of it for a while." He gazed at her hand, noticing the subtle tremor that age brought. And something deep inside him softened a tenderness he hadn't allowed himself in years. By nightfall, the cabin was filled with the scent of wood smoke and timeless moments. Outside, the wind had quieted into a calm hush, a peace that only follows a storm. Mary ate in silence, thanking him between each bite. Scout and Daisy nibbled on scraps beneath the table tails, wagging softly. Rex rested nearby, his patient eyes carrying the wisdom of 6 full years. After dinner, Mary settled by the window, gazing at the moon suspended above the pines. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. "You know," she said after a long pause, "I asked God last month to send me someone I could help before winter's end. Someone who needed a reminder that there's still a reason to get up in the morning." She smiled gently. "I never imagined he'd send a stubborn ex-Navy SEAL and a pair of frozen pups right to my doorstep." Caleb let out a soft laugh. "He works in mysterious ways." Mary nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe he uses broken souls like us to help others who understand the pain all too well." The fire crackled suddenly. Caleb gazed deep into the flickering flames, tightening his jaw ever so slightly. "I spent years thinking if I stayed silent long enough, the guilt would fade. But guilt doesn't just disappear," Mary said gently. "It waits patiently for forgiveness. And forgiveness isn't something you earn, it's something you let yourself receive." He remained quiet. But when she softly hummed a hymn, her voice trembling with the weight of time, he offered no resistance. The melody wrapped around the cabin like a tender prayer. Later that night, after Mary had drifted off, and the fire was reduced to glowing embers, Caleb sat alone at the table. The puppies dreamed peacefully beside Rex, their tiny bodies twitching in quiet slumber. Outside, moonlight draped the snow in a shimmering silver. He reached for an old notebook, the one that had endured deployments, storms and silent heavy years, and flipped to a blank page. For a long moment he stared at it, pen poised but still. Then slowly he began to write. Maybe saving them is how God saved me. He placed the pen down, leaned back, and exhaled deeply. The words were simple yet profound, the kind of truth that needs no explanation. The wind slipped gently through the pines outside, carrying with it the soft murmur of Mary's prayer. Inside, the fire flickered again, and Caleb felt for the first time in years that he was not alone. The mountains never gave a second warning. The first sign was always the wind, a low, distant growl weaving through the pines like a beast stirring from slumber. By afternoon, the sky turned slate gray, and snow began falling once more, thick and heavy, erasing any trace of the path leading to Caleb's cabin. He stood by the window, one hand resting on the wooden frame, watching the storm gather its strength. The silent grace of the snowfall no longer deceived him. He could feel danger pulsing in its rhythm. Beyond those trees, men were on their way. Rex sat at his feet, muscles coiled, his gaze fixed on the tree line. Scout and Daisy curled up close near the hearth, their small bodies pressed tightly together, trembling with each gust that rattled the glass. The fire cast flickering shadows on the cabin walls, yet it wasn't nearly enough to keep the creeping cold at bay. Caleb turned to the stove, pushing another log into the flames. His breath came out in small, misty clouds. "They'll arrive before nightfall," he murmured. Rex's ears twitched as though he understood every word. Outside, the snow thickened, forming a curtain of white. The forest, once his sanctuary, now felt cramped, suffocating. He inspected the door, the windows, and the rifle resting against the wall. He had cleaned it that very morning out of habit, his hands moving with the same steady precision that had saved lives before. But this time he wasn't battling for orders or a mission. He was fighting for a home he'd thought he'd never deserve. His eyes fell on the puppies curled beside the fire. Scout stirred, a tiny paw twitching. "You chose the wrong man to pin your hopes on, little one," Caleb whispered. Yet even as he spoke, a quiet defiance welled within his chest, an unyielding refusal to accept defeat. As daylight faded, the storm unleashed its fury. Snow battered the cabin, howling through every crack in the wood. The outside world vanished into a white frenzy. Then slicing through the roaring wind came Rex's low growl, sharp and clear. Caleb snapped his head toward the door. The dog stood, rigid ears pricked, forward teeth bared. A shadow moved slowly behind the frost-covered window, tall and indistinct. Another shadow followed. Caleb's heart pounded against his ribs. "They found us," he breathed. Instinctively, he grabbed the rifle and checked the chamber, then signaled Rex to stay close by the back wall. "Keep low." He crossed the room in long strides, peered through a narrow crack in the boarded-up window, and saw them, two men trudging through the snow. Their flashlights cut pale beams through the storm. They wore heavy coats, faces half hidden, but Caleb recognized the build, the gait, those same men from the sheds, the ones who'd fired at him. His breath steadied. The soldier inside him surged back, cold and composed. He pulled the curtain shut and crouched by the fire, whispering, "Be quiet now." Scout whimpered softly. Rex pressed his body low to the floor, a silent force of muscle and intent. Then came the first knock, sharp, 3 hard bangs echoing through the cabin. "Open up!" a voice shouted, muffled but fierce. "We know you're hidden inside." Caleb stayed silent. The second man cursed under his breath. "You think you can stash a camera, soldier boy? Surrender it now and maybe we won't torch this place." His gaze flicked to the corner where his phone lay, its battery, almost dead but still holding the proof. That footage could unravel everything. A precious piece of evidence. That very morning, through a fragile signal, he'd sent Mary a copy just in case. Now it might be the only barrier between justice and silence. The pounding knocked, louder hinges groaned. Caleb raised his rifle, exhaling slow and steady. Outside, the storm howled fiercely, snow striking the cabin like relentless fists. Then silence. The footsteps retreated, crunching through powdered drifts. Caleb strained to hear, nothing but the wind's mournful cry. He turned toward Rex. They're circling. The dog's low growl answered with dark agreement. Caleb's eyes swept the back window. Snow blurred the world outside. Then faint glimmers, a second group moving between the trees. 4 or 5 shadows waiting in the cold. They bided their time until nightfall. Back down in town, Mary Bennett felt the storm shaking her very home. The wind howled down Main Street, slamming shutter after shutter, slicing the power lines. The bakery's sign clanged violently in the furious gusts. She stood by the window, pulling her coat tight against the chill. Every fiber of her ached to charge back into those woods, but the roads were barred. So she gathered her shawl and stepped into the biting cold. Snow lashed her face, blinding and cruel. Still she pressed onward to the church atop the hill. The doors stood open, candles flickering gently their flames, a soft refuge amid the storm, as townsfolk huddled inside for shelter. Reverend Paul Turner, a tall figure in his 50s with a face marked by kindness and a voice roughened by years of harsh winters, adjusted the trembling candles with worn hands. His dark hair threaded with silver spoke of wisdom earned. Mary entered, and he lifted his gaze, startled. "Mary, in weather like this?" She shut the door resolutely. "We need to pray," she insisted, "for Caleb Hawkins." The Reverend blinked, taken aback. "The veteran living by Coldwater Ridge?" She nodded firmly. "He's out there, Reverend. He's in grave danger." Word spread swiftly through the close-knit town. Despite the raging storm, people gathered, farmers, bakers, children wrapped in blankets. Mary stood at the front, her hands tightly clenched. "He's one of us," she declared, voice trembling yet fierce. A man who had lost everything, but still opened his door when someone cried for rescue. Tonight he's fighting once more, not for war, but for mercy. Reverend Paul nodded and lit another line of candles. "Then we pray," he said solemnly. "We pray that God's light will guide the soldier through the darkest storm." Soon, all of Silver Hollow shimmered with candlelight. Windows along Main Street burned like distant stars in the night. Children pressed palms to the glass, whispering hope into the swirling snow. Far above the town, tucked deep in the hills, Caleb's cabin burned like a lone beacon in the blizzard. Inside, the wind battered the walls, desperate to snuff out the flame. Caleb checked his ammo once more, breath calm and steady. The pup whimpered softly again, and he bent down, resting his hand gently on the little dog's head. "It's okay," he whispered softly. "You stay right here with Rex." Suddenly, a branch crashed against the roof, rattling the cabin violently. Then voices rose again, now much closer, footsteps crunching just outside the door. Caleb raised his rifle, eyes narrowing with fierce focus. He could feel his heartbeat pounding, mingling with the howling storm. For a long, tense moment, all was still. Then, a man's voice yelled out, "You can't hide forever, soldier." Caleb exhaled slowly, his gaze locked on the door. His muscles eased, not in defeat, but with a hard-earned clarity. He had fought endless battles under commands that never brought peace, but this was different. The faces behind him weren't comrades. They were his purpose. He looked down at Rex, then toward the flickering fire. "If this is the last fight," he murmured, "at least we won't stand alone." The storm outside answered with a fierce howl, carrying faint echoes of distant church bells from the valley below, barely perceptible beneath the wind's roar. Yet the tempest raged on through the night, battering the cabin with fierce gusts that sounded like ghosts from a life long gone. By the time the first pale light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up window, the world outside was a swirling blur of white and shadow, and Caleb hadn't found sleep. He sat close to the fire, his rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed, unblinking on the door. Rex lay beside him, every muscle tense, his coat bristling with alertness. Scout and Daisy curled beside the hearth, their small frames trembling, oblivious to just how fragile the morning felt. Suddenly a sound sliced through the storm, the crunch of boots on frozen snow. Then another step. Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle. He leaned close to Rex and whispered, "It begins now." The dog's ears perked, a low growl bubbling deep in his throat. The door shook once, twice, before bursting inward with a thunderous crack. Snow exploded into the cabin as two figures stormed inside heavy coats dusted with white, faces concealed by scarves and raw fury. The taller man, his head shaved clean, wielded a shotgun. The shorter one, gray-bearded and fierce, carried a crowbar. "Told you we'd find him," the tall man snarled. Caleb fired a single warning shot into the floorboards, forcing both men to duck for cover. "Drop it," he barked, voice sharp and commanding. "One more step and I swear you won't be walking out again." The tall man laughed cold and harsh. "You really think you can scare us, soldier? We've got you outnumbered." Yet his voice wavered, spilling a hint of doubt. Outside, the storm swallowed every sound, but Caleb caught it. More footsteps were closing in from behind the cabin. His heartbeat steadied. "Rex," he breathed. The German Shepherd exploded forward, a blur of black and tan, teeth bared and ready. He struck the gray-bearded man first, slamming him into the wall. The shotgun roared behind him. Splinters flew, grazing Caleb's shoulder with a sharp but clean sting. He pushed through the pain, driving his elbow hard into the tall man's ribs. The man grunted and dropped the gun. For a few frantic seconds, chaos ruled the cramped cabin. Rex's growls echoed as he pinned the bearded man firmly to the floor. The taller one scrambled to reach his weapon, but Caleb kicked it away, grabbing him fiercely by the collar. "You hurt those animals," he hissed, "and you came back for me. You made your decision!" The man swung wildly, delivering a sharp blow to Caleb's cheek. Blood stung his eye, but he stood unshaken. He slammed the man against the wall. The heavy thud rang out above the howling storm. Then, cutting through the wind, a distant wail rose. A siren. Caleb froze. For a fleeting moment, disbelief flickered through him. Then he heard it again, this time nearer, growing louder. The tall man cursed under his breath. "Police." He shoved Caleb backwards, stumbling toward the door. But Rex was quicker. The dog lunged once more, teeth snapping just inches from the man's arm. The door flew open before either could react, flooding the cabin with a sharp, bright light. "Please drop your weapons." Two officers in heavy parkas stormed inside, rifles raised high. Their badges shimmered in the pale snow glow. Behind them stepped the unmistakable figure of Sheriff Tom Keller, a man in his late 50s with a strong jawline, streaks of gray cutting through his hair and eyes, weathered by countless winters. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the steady calm of a seasoned Marine. His deep voice pierced through the storm's howl. "Hands where I can see them." The arrogant smirk vanished from the tall man's face. Slowly, he raised his hands as the officers cuffed both intruders and dragged them outside. Caleb lowered his rifle, finally exhaling after what felt like hours of tension. "Rex, heel," he murmured. The German Shepherd instantly obeyed, panting eyes sharp yet peaceful. Caleb knelt beside him, trembling fingers running through his fur. "Good boy. Looks like you've had quite the night," Keller said, stepping inside the cabin. Snow melted from his coat, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "We got a call from Mrs. Bennett around midnight saying you might be in need of some company." Caleb wiped the blood from his cheek. "She's got impeccable timing." The sheriff studied him carefully. "You still know how to stand your ground. Some things never fade," Caleb replied. "Yeah, well," Keller said, eyeing the two shivering puppies curled near the fire. "Seems like you handled a whole lot more than just yourself this time." Not long after, Mary appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a thick wool coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold and worry. Seeing Caleb standing there, bruised, worn but alive, tears welled in her eyes. "You stubborn fool," she whispered, stepping forward to place a gentle hand on his arm. "I told you angels keep watch over good men." He offered a faint smile, uncertain if he deserved it. "You do now," she said softly.